More ahead of the budget now, and the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has just days to go, of course, until the Labour government delivers its first budget in more than 14 years. And we're starting to get much more of a sense of where some of the government's money is going to be spent and just how those funds will be raised, although it's kind of our money if we pay taxes, isn't it? The Chancellor has admitted the budget will be one for what she calls strivers, and she says she has the back of hard-working people. In a newspaper piece this morning, Rachel Reeves said not everything will be easy and tough but fair decisions would be taken on taxes. With a reported big black hole, 22 billion, 40 billion, depending on what you read in the public finances to plug, increases in the taxes appear increasingly likely when Rachel Reeves presents her first budget on Wednesday. Here to give us more details about what we might be able to expect and what may even be missing is senior economist Dr. Benjamin Caswell and Harry Quilter-Pinner, Executive Director of the Institute for Public Policy Research. It is good to have you both with us. Look, I'm sure you feel the same way as me. We've been talking about this budget for what feels like forever, and it still isn't here. We've got to wait till Wednesday. But Benjamin, if I can come to you first, based on everything you've heard, what kind of leaps out as the biggest surprise or perhaps the biggest challenge for the Chancellor?
So, morning, Matt. So this budget is probably the most consequential budget of the last decade. It's really the new government's opportunity to define its economic vision for the UK and to put some meat on the bones of those manifesto pledges. Now, in terms of surprises, I think one of the more bold moves is that the Chancellor has moved one of the measures of debt in the fiscal rules. So that is to say, a move from public sector net debt to public sector net financial liabilities. Now, those are quite long words, but let's just sort of set them in the context of an analogy of a household. So the public sector net debt in terms of a household would sort of be equivalent to their mortgage debt or their credit card debt, which is essentially just the household's visible debt. Now, this move to public sector net financial liabilities in terms of a household would be more inclusive. So it would include, for example, savings of a household in their savings account, or any other financial asset that a household may have that it could sell off quickly if it needed to. For example, you may have some premium bonds. You could sell them quickly if you needed to. So it's a more expansive measure, which is really more of a proxy for net financial position of the government. And because it's more expansive, it includes the asset side as well as the liability side. It gives the Chancellor a bit more fiscal room to sort of spend, to boost expenditure on the NHS, to invest in public infrastructure and things like that. So the move towards this is essentially giving her a bit more wiggle room to get that spending up and to get that public investment up.
And just a final point on shifting those rules to perhaps be able to leverage the assets. In terms of shifting it, it means they can potentially sell things if they want at short notice to raise a bit more money, because people remember that Gordon Brown did that with gold reserves, for example.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, we hope it would not ever come to that. But the point is that you do have some collateral there if need be. So, for example, the government does have significant financial assets. For example, it has all of the student loans on its balance sheet. It also has some pension funds on its sheets as well. So really, it's just there as a way of staking that, OK, look, the government has an asset side as well as a liability side. And as long as public investment and government expenditure plans are well communicated, as long as the international markets understand why this is being done and there's a return on their investment, then there's no reason that the markets should turn illiquid and people should be spooked or anything like that. So as long as the independent advice of the OBR is respected, as long as it's well communicated, there's no risk of anything happening like we saw a couple of years ago.
Harry, you were nodding there in agreement. I mean, it certainly does feel like it's the most consequential budget in a long, long time. But the Chancellor says there are no easy decisions here. In fact, it looks pretty tough. Whatever she does, there are potential downsides with everything, aren't there?
I think there are two big tests for the Chancellor at the budget. The first is, can it be a pro-growth budget? And the biggest thing holding that back is the lack of investment in this country, which is why the fiscal rule changes that we've just been talking about are so important. And if she can get that investment up, that should drive growth and higher wages in this country, which are vitally needed. I think that's a win-win situation. I don't think there's, if they do that carefully in the way we've just described, that should be a win-win. Where it gets harder is the second big test for the Chancellor at the budget is how do you prevent the second wave of austerity? How do you get investment into our public services on a day-to-day basis? And this is where it gets a bit tougher because she has to find the revenue for that through tax increases. And fundamentally, we all would rather not pay more tax, even though we want the things that that tax is invested in. Our recommendation at the IPPR has been that the Chancellor starts with those with the broadest shoulders in trying to get that tax revenue. That will be people with wealth or assets, so taxing assets at the same rate that we currently tax work.
Harry, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to jump in because there's all these euphemisms being bandied about working people, strivers, those with the broadest shoulders. What do you mean by those with the broadest shoulders? How much do they earn? What do they have in their pockets?
Well, I mean, obviously we've got this debate about what does working people mean. That's a debate for the Labour Party to settle. And
that's a never-ending debate, that one, so let's not go there. But broadest shoulders, let's talk that.
Broadest shoulders for me means two things. It would mean at the moment, if I earn my income from work, as I do, I will pay a certain tax rate, probably about 40p on the pound on income tax. If I earn my income from shares or from owning a second house, the tax rate I would pay is a lot lower. That for me feels unfair because you've got assets, you're probably better off. You should be paying the same rate on that tax as a nurse or a retail worker would. That's point one. And point two would be asking businesses to contribute a bit more. I'd like to see that focused on bigger businesses. Concerned about entrepreneurs and startups and small businesses. But I think asking business to contribute a bit more towards, for example, the NHS, when we know that one of the biggest barriers to business growth at the moment is a shortage of labour that's caused in part by people who are sick falling out of the labour market because the NHS can't support them.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and just a reminder of how all these things are interconnected. Benjamin, just coming back to you, let's take that capital gains thing first. I mean, there's this assumption that people have other properties, they're raking it in. But of course, the people who own the most properties are the landlords who are perhaps renting out those properties to key workers. So it's also linked in that way. What happens then? If they're going to be taxed on those properties, well, they're going to sell them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, at the moment, capital gains tax is a relatively small tax. It doesn't bring in too much money. But essentially, when it comes to taxing income versus from labor versus taxing your income from capital, there are really many sort of different effects going on. So in a sense, we don't want to tax capital income too heavily in the sense that we don't want to discourage investment and discourage savings. So for example, if you get some of your income through property, we wouldn't want to sort of exacerbate the housing crisis by reducing the supply of capital and reducing the housing stock. So really, it would sort of depend on who's bearing the burden of this tax. And when it comes to specifically working people, this is really a bit of political speak or a bit of political technology because there is no real good definition of working people. What I would emphasize is that at the moment, although the current government have said that they won't raise taxes on working people, the current phenomenon of fiscal drag means that essentially there is an income tax rise going on working people. And it is particularly regressive as well because it's people who are towards the bottom end of the distribution, who are near that 20% threshold, that 40% threshold, who are being dragged into higher bands at the moment. So really, we have to think about that as well and think about how that tax burden is shared among people in the whole economy.
Keeping those bands where they were was brought in by Jeremy Hunt for, I think, till 2028, and we think that Labour might extend that beyond that year. Listen, we've only got a few seconds left, so I'm going to put you both on the spot as to what you think, Harry first, is the most consequential element of this consequential budget for people.
I think the biggest thing here is the change in fiscal rule, and as long as that money is put into investment, the biggest thing holding our economy back is low investment. That's the big thing she has to tackle if she wants growth to increase.
Benjamin, final word to you on that one.
So I think the fiscal rules are consequential. The second most consequential thing, I think, is also the commitment to keep corporation tax at 25% and maintain the full expensing. So that's going to be a good news for business investment, which has been very low in the UK, and it's going to help investors have confidence in the UK economy going forward.
Benjamin, Harry, good to see you both. Thank you so much for your expertise.
Thank you.